He didn't pull the trigger. He didn't fire the gun that ended 3 young lives that night. But 25 years later, he would be the one strapped to a gurney with the world watching, waiting for his final breath. This is the story of Dustin John Higgs, a man condemned for a crime he never physically committed, yet punished with the ultimate sentence. A story that raises questions no courtroom can easily answer. Can someone deserve to die for words they allegedly spoke? Or was justice served that January night in 2021 when the federal needle pierced his arm? Before we go deeper, if you believe every story deserves to be heard completely, take a moment to subscribe, because here we search for truth, not sensation. Before the mugshots, before the courtroom, there was just a young boy trying to make sense of the world around him. Dustin John Higgs was born on March 10, 1972, in Poughkeepsie, New York. His early years were marked by instability, a childhood caught between hardship and hope. When he was just 10 years old, Dustin lost his mother to cancer. It was the kind of loss that quietly rearranges a life, the kind that never really leaves. After her death, he went to live with his aunt and uncle, who did their best to raise him and keep him grounded. But the absence of his parents left an ache that would follow him into adulthood. In school, Dustin struggled early, repeating second grade because of reading difficulties. Still, he pushed through, eventually graduating high school at 19, a small victory in a life that had already seen too much loss. Those who knew him described a young man who was quiet, intelligent, even charming at times, someone who could adapt to any crowd but never quite fit in. His father was mostly absent, and by the time Dustin entered adulthood, he was already used to standing on his own. By the mid-1990s, Dustin was living in Maryland, working and trying to carve out a stable life. But the choices he made and the people he surrounded himself with would soon pull him into a storm that no one could escape. A single night in January 1996 would take 3 lives and change his forever. It was the night of January 26, 1996. The streets of Laurel, Maryland were quiet, the kind of cold that clings to your breath and makes everything feel still. Inside a small apartment, a group of friends gathered: Dustin Higgs, Willis Haynes, Victor Gloria, and 3 young women: Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn. They shared drinks, music, conversation, the kind of night that at first glance seems harmless. But as the hours passed, tension replaced laughter. A disagreement, small, sudden, and confusing, flared between Dustin and one of the women. Witnesses later said it was nothing more than words, but words have a way of changing everything. Soon after, the women decided to leave. Dustin offered to drive them home, a gesture that would soon be dissected in courtrooms for years to come. Haynes and Gloria joined him in the van as the women climbed in. No one could have known it was a ride from which 3 of them would never return. What happened next, only 3 men truly knew. But the official version, the one recorded in police files and replayed at trial, goes like this. Dustin drove the van toward a remote area near the Patuxent Research Refuge, a patch of federal land, silent and dark. At some point, he pulled over. Haynes stepped out, and shots echoed through the night. 3 young women, their lives cut short in an instant. And a chain of events that would drag all 3 men into the eye of a storm that would last for decades. When police discovered the bodies, the scene told a story of rage and execution. But whose rage? Whose decision? The weapon belonged to someone, the vehicle to someone, but the truth was buried beneath fear, loyalty, and contradiction. Within days, investigators were chasing leads. Friends questioned, alibis compared, stories twisted and retold. And through it all, one name began to rise: Dustin John Higgs. But was he the mastermind, or a man being dragged down by association? The investigation was only beginning, and the evidence they would find would seal Dustin's fate for the next 25 years. In the days that followed the discovery, police worked relentlessly to piece together what had happened that night. They knew 3 women were dead, all found near the quiet isolation of federal land. At first, the clues were scarce. There were no eyewitnesses to the shootings, just a trail of contradictions and fragments of truth. Investigators questioned everyone connected to that night, and slowly a picture began to form. One man, Victor Gloria, started talking. His statements painted Dustin Higgs as the one who gave the orders, the man who drove, argued, and demanded silence. But his version of events changed more than once. Each retelling shifted slightly, as though the truth itself was slipping through the cracks. At one point, he claimed Haynes was the shooter. At another, that Dustin told him to do it. It was hard to tell where memory ended and survival began. Still, the narrative hardened around Dustin. He was the one who owned the van, the one who led the drive into the darkness, and in the eyes of the law, the one who orchestrated the violence, even if he never touched the gun. By the time agents arrived at Dustin's door, his life had already unraveled. They charged him with 3 counts of first-degree murder, 3 counts of kidnapping, and use of a firearm during a crime of violence. Under federal law, those charges carried one outcome: death. But when questioned, Dustin didn't break. He insisted he was innocent. He admitted being there, yes, but he denied giving any order to kill. He said Haynes acted on his own, and that by the time he realized what had happened, it was already too late. The case against him rested not on fingerprints or blood, but on interpretation, the belief that his words, his silence, his presence meant intent. And so, in the eyes of investigators, Dustin wasn't just an accomplice. He was the instigator, the mind behind the murders. Whether that conclusion was fair or not would become the battle of his life. By October of the year 2000, the long wait was over. After 4 years of investigation, the case of United States versus Dustin John Higgs finally went to trial. In that courtroom, the air was thick with grief. 3 families searching for justice, and 1 man fighting for his life. The prosecution told a simple but devastating story. They said Dustin Higgs was the leader, the one in control, the one who wanted revenge after an argument with one of the women. He didn't fire the gun, they admitted, but he gave the order. He directed the van, brought the weapon, and made sure there were no witnesses left alive. For the government, that was enough. In their eyes, authority meant guilt. And under federal law, ordering a murder carried the same weight as pulling the trigger yourself. Then came the defense. They painted a different picture of a man caught in chaos, not in control of it. They pointed to the inconsistencies in testimony, especially from Victor Gloria, whose plea deal granted him leniency in exchange for cooperation. His story, they argued, changed too many times to be trusted, and Willis Haynes, the admitted shooter, wasn't there to testify. But through letters and statements, he would later claim that Dustin never ordered him to do anything, that he acted on his own. It was a haunting contradiction at the center of the case. As the weeks passed, the jury listened to hours of evidence, photographs, and conflicting accounts. When the time came to decide, they found Dustin Higgs guilty on all counts: 3 for first-degree murder, 3 for kidnapping resulting in death, and 3 for using a firearm in a violent crime. The judge's words were measured, but the meaning was final: death by lethal injection. It was the first federal death sentence handed down in Maryland in decades. For the families of Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn, it was closure, perhaps not peace, but certainty. For Dustin, it was the beginning of a long, lonely countdown. Behind bars, he continued to insist on his innocence, writing letters, filing appeals, and holding to one statement he never changed: "I did not order those murders." In the years that followed his conviction, Dustin Higgs lived in the shadow of death. Each day inside USP Terre Haute, the federal prison where the nation's executions are carried out, was another reminder that time, for him, had an expiration date. But Dustin didn't stop fighting. He appealed his case through every possible court, arguing that he'd been sentenced to die for a crime he didn't physically commit. His lawyers pointed to the shifting testimonies, the absence of forensic proof tying him directly to the murders, and the fact that the actual shooter, Willis Haynes, had received life, not death. They argued that the system was punishing a man for his association, not his actions, and they weren't alone. In the final years of his life, voices began to rise: activists, lawyers, and even some former officials, all questioning whether executing Higgs would truly serve justice. Still, the court stood firm. Each appeal ended the same way: denied. Then came 2020. The world was gripped by a pandemic, and the federal government had just resumed executions after nearly 2 decades of silence. As Dustin waited for his fate, he tested positive for COVID-19. His defense argued that the infection had damaged his lungs, that lethal injection could cause him to suffocate, gasping for air as the drugs took effect. They called it cruel, unnecessary, inhumane. A federal judge granted a temporary stay. For a moment, there was hope. But on January 15, 2021, the Supreme Court lifted that stay, clearing the way for his execution. By the next day, it was over. In the early hours of January 16th, Dustin Higgs was led to the execution chamber. Witnesses described him as calm, composed, his voice steady as he turned toward the room. His final words were clear: "I am an innocent man. I did not order the murders." At 1:23 a.m., he was pronounced dead, the last person to be executed by the federal government under the Trump administration. And with him, an era of resumed federal executions came to an end. For some, it was justice long overdue. For others, a haunting example of how imperfect the death penalty can be, how it sometimes answers questions that were never fully understood. What remains are the lives lost: Tamika Black, Tanji Jackson, and Mishann Chinn, and the long echo of a case that will forever raise the same difficult question. Did justice truly prevail, or was another life taken in its name?